Welcome to Will's Personal Development Podcast, where we help Asian American millennial men succeed in wealth, fitness, happiness, and relationships. But mainly wealth and relationships. And of course, there's also people who aren't Asian Americans who listen to this. But let's just get started. Today we have a Q&A session. So this is going to be different from my typical podcast where I focus on one topic or problem, try and answer that problem. This one will be a slightly faster paced episode where I'll touch on a few different topics that are commonly asked from my email subscribers and readers. And so let's just get started straight off the bat. I think there's quite a few common issues, but let's just get to the main ones. So some people have written in and told me that they would love to learn more about productivity. Many of them resonate a lot with my productivity posts in the past, and some don't know that I've written past articles and released previous content on productivity. So if you haven't, check out my blog, willyoulaugh.com. There's plenty of productivity articles around if you take a look, and it's definitely worth your time. If you go to Google and you search productivity and then you add a space and then my domain name, which is willyoulaugh.com, you'll find the articles, or you can search time management and you'll find more articles. However, I think the big tip I can give you and most people who are listening to this who struggle with productivity, usually it has to do with a management of the time you have. And I know it's tough. I know some people are really hard workers and they work from when they wake up until when they go to sleep. I've experienced that. I know how tough it can be. However, I think usually, especially if you're under 30 years of age, usually there's a lot more time you can squeeze out of the day without ever getting burnt out. And I think that's one of the big issues that can be tackled. So a common theme I'll see is people will say, I don't have any free time, or I have, obligations and other people I have to manage or deal with, and I don't have any time. Usually they do. They have more time and they can use the time that they have more effectively. So when it comes to not having enough time, the one way to being brutally honest with yourself is to track how you spend every minute of your day for an entire day. If you do that for a couple of days and then you add up all the time that's categorized as wasteful time, you'll be shocked at the results. So look at the math. I mean, if you look at the simple math and you kind of broadly categorize everything, like what are you doing from the time you get home until when you go to sleep? If you're sleeping at 1 a.m. or midnight and you come home from school or you come home from work at 5 o'clock or earlier, 4 o'clock, what are you doing for those 9-10 hours? And usually the results are not so pretty. But when you actually track it, typically when I do it, you find that it's not as bad as you think, but it's still fairly bad. What I mean by this is, like, initially you're like, oh my goodness, I've just been wasting 7 hours a day doing nothing. In reality, there's stuff you never really account for until you're consciously aware of them. So there's chores, there's laundry, there's an unexpected tax return you have to file. Maybe your phone breaks and you have to get it replaced. And when you go to the phone service kiosk to get it fixed, turns out the phone's not compatible. So there's a bunch of miscellaneous chores that you have to do, whether it's a car repair or oil change, that do consume time. Maybe you have to visit your parents and your parents need your help doing the chores. But even with that accounted for, there's still a large chunk of free time that you do have. So it's not as bad as you think. You might think, oh my goodness, I'm wasting 5 hours a day. Usually it's more closer to 3 or 2, but it's still a good chunk of time that you're wasting. And then there's the time where you think you're spending constantly working or studying or doing a side hustle that isn't as effective as you think. When you actually track it down, you realize, oh my goodness, I waste 10 minutes every hour jumping on the Facebook, or small talk with coworkers, or eating snacks, or wandering off to these websites. And then, I get off track and do this and that. And sometimes it's up to 20, 30 minutes per hour. So you have to really, dial that down, figure out how to create systems to really work properly. And the best way I found, and this is something that Brendon Burchard's book, High Performance, details immensely, but there's many other movements that are very big that follow a similar model. Specifically, the Pomodoro technique is a huge movement of hundreds of thousands of productivity junkies who love this model. And the basic premise of all these different communities is that they recommend breaking your work into 20 to 40 minute chunks with 5 to 10 minute breaks in between each of those chunks. They believe that it's inefficient and draining to attempt to do a 4-hour nonstop work hustle chunk where you just focus without any breaks. And Brendon Burchard, if you read High Performance Habits, this book really goes into depth with a lot of data to back up his assertions. He has literally trained and impacted millions of people. He sold courses for these topics to hundreds of thousands. He's surveyed and analyzed tens of thousands and collected data points on hundreds of thousands, and coached thousands of high performing people, including Olympians, athletes, Fortune 50 CEOs, some of the top people in the country, and other, C-suite executives and so forth. So he drew from all that data, all those data points, to really identify correlations in high performing people. And of course, one of his findings was this systemized process of efficient work that needs to get done. And he recommends, very similar to a Pomodoro technique, these bite-sized chunks that are still fairly long, but interspersed with breaks where you have to move around, take a walk, relax for at least 5 minutes, but no longer than 10. So that's what I suggest. And if you try that out, you can see results in the next day or so to see if that will diminish the amount of time you end up wasting on social media or other areas that just drain your productivity. Another big thing is to really, pay attention to any type of apps or Chrome extensions or browser extensions that are free, and also block social media. So if it's your phone, sometimes it's just worth deleting Instagram off, but sometimes that's not enough. There's apps, and there's also free browser extensions that will remove it off. There's also free browser extensions like I think one's called Time Tracker, another's called Harvest Time. But the basic idea behind most of these is that they will automatically track your time for you. I suggest this as a rough estimate alternative if you're too lazy to literally write down how you track all your time, because it's only a rough estimate. I've experimented with many of these extensions, and the precision with which they track things is just kind of off. First off, they lump things together, so like any miscellaneous site that they don't recognize just gets lumped into the other category. So you have this giant chunk that's like 35% of your time that's just lumped as other, and it's really like hundreds of random sites, from specific other self-development blogs I read to news sites and random other stuff. So it's not the most precise, and it only tracks your online time. So you won't catch all the time that you're spending in the bathroom and so forth. So it's only a supplement. I still think it's useful, so check it out if you're interested. But other than that, just stick to the manual tracking that I recommend, and the site blockers, and they're great for just getting rid of social media. Let's just be frank. Social media usually is psychologically built to suck you in. They have algorithms and thousands of employees built to find the best ways of hooking you in and keeping you on the site. So once you're hooked, just like a hard drug, it's very hard to get off of it, even if you dedicate yourself to only 10 minutes of YouTube or Instagram. I think YouTube's probably the most sinister right now. They're very good at it. And coming from a social media influencer, me, I'm one of the only people who will tell you this, because I'm looking out for your best interest rather than my best interest, which is, what other influencers sometimes do. They want you to stay on their site to follow them so they'll make more money, rather than trying to help you more by telling the truth, which is sometimes to get off social media. And I do this because I think in the long run, it will benefit me to help you, because if I put your value above mine, then I think in the long run, it'll end up, coming back to me in some way, shape, or form. So that's all I have to say with productivity for now. Again, check out my blog post. I even wrote a blog post on the top 10 productivity tools of this year. And I mentioned a lot of the site blockers and extensions that you can check out. And I provide links. So that's on my site, willyoulaugh.com. I'm going to move on to another topic that has been requested, which is understanding what or who should be your mentor and how to find this mentor. I think this is a very common topic, rightfully so, because a lot of self-development gurus, millionaire experts online, they all mention how important it is to have a mentor. And then there's books and examples of all these people who are now successful and had mentors. Everyone from Warren Buffett, who had Benjamin Graham as a mentor, to Bill Gates, who had, I think his name's Paul Allen, as a mentor, and so on and so forth. Apparently, like every artist you can think of, every musician, Jay-Z, and so on and so forth, they've had mentors, and it's, at least that's how it appears. And the first thing I want to reveal is the truth about mentors. Jack Welch's book, Winning, goes into a lot more detail on this, so I recommend this. And I try and be very evidence-backed with all my advice. So I want to give credit where it's due. I'm sourcing this mainly from Jack Welch's content. He has a whole chapter on the truth about mentors. And first off, it's not like you only have one person who's your mentor for the rest of your life. It may seem like that way, and that's how I believed it for a while. I thought like, I had to have this one guy who was super amazing, much older than me, and he has to kind of like, stand next to me at all times or for most of my week and just like teach me and guide me on my craft. And that's how I'm going to succeed. And I'm going to stay with this guy for 30 years and all of a sudden I'll be super successful because I've somehow found my passion, and that skill somehow correlates with this individual who's somehow willing to help me. Now you can already see how ridiculous this is on multiple points, and how, lucky you have to be, or, how the stars have to align in so many ways. First off, you have to already have stumbled across your passion at a young age. And this passion also has to be something that leads to something that makes a lot of money one day, because apparently that's what most people want who ask this question. They want a mentor that would make them more money. Also, there's a bunch of other things that have to align. For some reason, this mentor, without having been paid, is somehow incentivized to spend time out of their own day to spend all this time with you and train you, and so on and so forth. Now, this myth about how a mentor has to be like this is propagated in many different fields, especially on YouTube, but also through books like Robert Greene's Mastery. But it's very common. There's a lot of people, Tai Lopez, Simple Pickup, Jump Cut Studios, and a number of people who emphasize the importance of a mentor. And I think a mentor is important, but I think the big clarifying thing that Jack Welch gets at in his chapter is that a mentor can be anyone. And usually you have many different mentors as you progress through life. Jack Welch credits his success to hundreds of mentors, some of them who were by job title beneath him. One time he was moved to a different department in his organization, General Electric, and it was a completely different industry. I believe it was like the plastics industry, and he was more so familiar with the aerospace division. And his mentor for a good few months was a man that was a few hierarchies below him in job title. If you're not familiar with General Electric, it has like thousands of employees, so you can imagine the hierarchy system. But this man knew all this stuff about the industry that he didn't. So for those few months, Jack would just ask him questions, and he would be very generous and kind and answer them and teach this guy about this industry. And for those months, he was this guy's mentor. And then, later on, it was another guy who, taught him a few things for a couple of days or a few hours. And so his point is that, many young people are very rigid, unnecessarily, and sometimes stupidly rigid with their definition of what a mentor is, when in reality, it's anyone who teaches you something that will benefit your life, whether it's a short period of time that they do this or a long period of time. And I really found that profound. And if there's anyone you can trust, it's this man, Jack Welch, who is one of the most decorated, respected business people, and has been for decades. He grew General Electric from a company that was failing to a company that is now one of the biggest in the world. And he literally 100x'd the size and profitability of a dying company. Again, check out his books if you really want to know the full story of how he did that. He had to do some really tough things, such as he decided to get rid of every industry that they were in, that they were not number one or number two. And so he had to cut a lot of divisions. But the point for you is that finding a mentor, I get it. You have this picture in your mind. I did for many years as a young guy, that you have to have this one person who's going to mentor you, and he has to be old and he has to be experienced, and he's just going to spend all his time with you, because that's kind of the idea that they, these successful people paint, and they tell you, and that's probably where you got the idea in the first place, that you need a, mentor. And there's, stuff that kind of correlate to that. You're like, oh, well, look at Warren Buffett. He had this guy who taught him for a while. And if you read Mastery by Robert Greene, he points to, the older eras of history where there wasn't school or anything. You lived in a village and you were apprentice for some person in the village. And that if that person was a blacksmith, then he was your mentor, and he would train you for 10 years on how to be a blacksmith, and then you would become that blacksmith. So that's kind of how it worked back in the day, and that's kind of where this mentor idea came from, this single individual. However, it's not like that anymore. I mean, in a sense, by you listening to this podcast, I'm your mentor for this brief moment in time. So just think of that, and you'll open up your growth a lot more. And by not being so closed-minded and rigid, you'll open yourself up to learning a lot more, adopting a lot more mentors, rather than closing yourself off in your room and saying, oh, I can't do anything or progress my life because I don't have this random guy who's going to devote his life to me. And even if you look closely at these people that they point to, and you really study their lives, which is another fallacy that these people use. If you really actually study the history of these lives, it's not necessarily like these mentors followed every step of these guys' moves, or even spent most of their week with these guys for 30 plus years. That's not always how it happens. I am a Warren Buffett superfan, so I've studied his biography and history immensely. And with Warren Buffett, he met his mentor, Benjamin Graham, in business school. So business school was, I think, only 1 year for him. It usually takes 2, but he had an accelerated program. So he only stayed there for a year. And so he was only with Ben Graham for a portion of that time, for a year. He was a business student, so, he had time allocated with Ben in class and then probably a little bit of extra time outside of class, but he was still a business student, so he didn't have the entire day with Ben Graham all the time. Ben Graham also had a company that he was running and other professor duties, so he wasn't spending, most of his day with Warren Buffett. And then after that, Warren begged Ben to work for him, and he would even offer to work for free. But Ben, at the time, and this also speaks to all the listeners who struggle with racism and complain about racism. It was still a big struggle back in the day, even worse than now. So Ben said no because he had a stock firm and people were discriminating against Jews at the time. So he tried to counteract that by only hiring Jews. And because Warren wasn't a Jew, he wasn't able to be hired. And so it was it was tough times all around, The Jews couldn't get hired, Warren couldn't get hired, and so forth. So, Warren didn't complain. Then he went back and worked for his father for a few years at his father's own stock firm. And then eventually Ben Graham changed his mind, and then he worked for Ben for several years before Ben decided to retire. So it wasn't this guy spent his life with this guy. He had to be patient, first off, and find ways of offering value. And he hustled with his, course to get the one and only A+ in Ben Graham's class to impress Ben. And then he had to be patient and even offer to work for free to offer some level of value to Ben and impress him in order to get that mentorship. And he was willing to, work for a few years with his dad and wait for Ben to change his mind. So that's another thing. You can't expect mentors to just, always, if you, and I'm specifically talking about the rigid form of mentorship that most people have in their mind. If you really want to pursue this image of a mentor where this is this one sole guy who's, teaching you, you have to offer value in some form. And sometimes, you will get lucky and they'll be impressed that a young person like you is interested in this topic and they'll give you a helping hand. Maybe they won't dedicate their entire day to you, but you shouldn't be expecting that. Even if they just give you a free internship or they give you some free resources or papers, that's a huge win. That's exactly what happened with Steve Jobs. When he was 12 years old, he phoned up this guy from Hewlett Packard, which was one of the king tech companies at the time. And he was just hey, could you give me some tips? Could you help me out? I'm trying to build this, this gadget. And the guy actually was a bit impressed and sent some free parts to him and then even offered him a job. It wasn't a glamorous job. It was a factory job, but Steve Jobs took that job and learned a lot about technology from it. So, first off, most people don't even ask. So if you don't even put yourself in the game and you don't even try, you're not even in the game and you're going to get a big fat no by default. So first step is actually trying. And then the second is all this patience and, trying to offer value in some form. Sometimes it is literally just paying for it. Maybe it's, working at McDonald's and saving up and spending that for a coach who can mentor you and they'll pay you and you'll pay them in the form of cash. That's another option. So that's what I gotta say about mentors. Just think it through. It's not just one guy. It doesn't always have to be one guy. And it doesn't have to be for the rest of your life. Next, and this will probably be the last point I'll be able to touch on. I have a request to talk about how to basically stop worrying about what others think, especially your parents. So, a lot of people, and it's not just Asians. I think the Asian American community, this is huge, but pretty much every culture, even, cultures you wouldn't expect, they have issues with, dealing with the pressure from their family. I've seen this from almost every race, black, white, Hispanic, pressure to not only become a doctor, but to succeed. I see that with every ethnicity. Obviously, it's more so for Asians, but I've seen it. People have talked to me about it. I've seen it firsthand, in person, from people my age and people younger. Now, how do you deal with this? Well, first off, not worrying at all about what others think is a disadvantage. There's a reason why genetically most of us have this. It's an advantage. It improves your empathy and emotional intelligence to be aware and think through what others are feeling so that you can communicate with them most effectively and navigate situations. The issue is when you do it too much. That's really what you're asking. So how do you stop worrying too much in certain situations? Maybe it's, sometimes it's just like family. Your parents, drilling down on you to do something you're not passionate about. Or it could be something completely different, like dating. Like, how do you stop caring what others think, such as when they reject you? Well, I read Mark Manson's book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. It's a very big bestseller. It was recently just released, and everyone's been talking about it. I read the whole book, and his whole premise really is just this whole idea that, like I said, there's times when you should care and there's times when you shouldn't, and you reserve it for when you should care. And it's good to care sometimes. Now, honestly, I think his thesis was a bit weak given the whole idea of the book, but I think it lacked more tactical, practical, and actionable tips. So what I really have to say is that, at some point, you have to decide. You have to decide what you want and, be willing to bear the consequences for it. Because you know the consequences. Be aware of the consequences, know the consequences, and then make your decision. Because even a non-decision is a decision. So, and that's probably the worst decision to make, a non-decision, being indecisive. The consequence is you're going to be unhappy if you take a job your parents like, but you don't like, or they're going to be unhappy, or you can find some middle ground. Maybe you can try and convince them otherwise. Usually it'll be one of the latter two. And sometimes you have to be fine with that, and that's okay. Sometimes they'll come around. I've seen it a lot. Sometimes they really do want your best interests, your own happiness. And that's what they wanted all along, and they thought that wealth would do that for you, when in reality it won't. It's more about passion for your career. Other times, there are really strict parents who just don't care as much about you as you think. They care more about you getting rich so they can get rich. And you have to deal with that. And you have to make the choice to just go your own way, do what you have to do for your own happiness over theirs, which is fine. It's against the Asian culture, but it's fine. So thanks for listening. Hopefully this helped. See you in the next episode.